last 24 hours, even in the last couple of days. I don't know if you all were aware that there was a missile that landed in Poland and 2 people were killed. And immediately my thought was, this came from Russia, this is going to lead to NATO countries getting directly involved. This is the kind of thing that we've been worried about for so long. And what turned out is that it seems that this was a missile, an errant missile from Ukraine, not from Russia. And what's interesting is the fallout from this now, which on the one hand, the US has said that they think that it is not a missile that came from Russia, even though the media reported immediately that it was a Russian missile. And Zelensky in Ukraine is saying this is not a Ukrainian missile. This is a Russian missile. And he is even saying that they don't believe what the head of Poland is saying, and Poland is basically Ukraine's best ally. And so the media is even talking about Poland and the West having a cover-up because they don't want to admit that this was a Russian missile because the NATO countries don't want to get directly involved, meaning they don't want to have to send in troops. But this just shows how delicate the situation is. I mean, this was one missile killing 2 people, which is a terrible shame. But this could happen any day. There are so many ways that the countries surrounding, the European countries surrounding Ukraine, could be involved in this. And this, when it happened on Tuesday, there was immediately the push by the US media in the State Department saying, are you going to invoke Article 4 of NATO, which means there has to be an emergency meeting of all the countries in NATO, and even asking, are you going to invoke Article 5, which is the countries have to protect the NATO country that has been attacked. This is the kind of thing that can lead us into a third world war or a nuclear war. And it is so precarious, the situation right now. And this is why we had somebody like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Milley, just a couple of days ago, praise Ukraine for the resistance and said, Ukraine is in a good position now to go for negotiations, and said, seize the moment and sit down at the table. Well, all hell broke loose in the Biden administration of them saying, no, no, no. I'm surprised the guy even has his job now. Let's see how long it lasts. They say, no, 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 that's not our position at all. We can't tell the Ukrainians when to negotiate. This is up to Ukraine to decide. Well, this is really a mask that the US puts on, because let's face it, it's the US and the West that have squashed talks that were happening at the end of March, beginning of April, that have really made Zelensky totally change his demands from ones where he said openly at one point after the invasion, we know that we cannot become a NATO country, that we have to be a neutral country, and we know there have to be compromises. To take now a maximalist position of saying we want every inch of Ukraine back, and we want to fast track into NATO. Well, people like Mark Milley and other generals in the US have said that is not a viable position, that there is basically now a stalemate. The American people might not be aware of that because that's not how it's portrayed in the media. In the media, it's portrayed that Ukraine is winning, Ukraine is winning, Ukraine just got this, Ukraine just got that. But the reality is that every time there is an achievement militarily by Ukraine, then Russia comes back with some horrific response, like they just did, lobbing all of these missiles and destroying more of the electrical grid, leaving millions more Ukrainians in the dark, without energy, as winter is approaching now. And so that's why it is clear to people who understand the military that there is not going to be a military solution to this. So where does each of the parties stand? I think Russia right now has basically been defeated. I mean, whatever Putin thought he was going to get out of going all the way to Kyiv obviously did not happen. And they are suffering terrible setbacks in the battlefield. There is increasing opposition within Russia. There is certainly a lot of censorship, but people are getting through that, especially young people. And we saw that when there was the call for 300,000 more reservists, how many people came out opposed and how many people fled the country. And I think the one thing that we can do is support the courageous people in Russia who are standing up and refusing to fight. There are coalitions now of organizations that are helping those young people, both in Russia, and there are people in Ukraine refusing to fight as well. They need financial support. They have gone to other countries when they can. They need jobs. And ironically, in places like the United States, they can't even get visas to come here. But there is a growing opposition within Russia, and while the sanctions against Russia have hurt Western Europe and countries as far away as Africa and the Middle East more than they have Russia right now, that will change as time goes on, and they find that they can't get the parts they need for their manufacturing sector, even the manufacturing of weapons, and people's lives will get harder and harder. In Ukraine, we know that people are suffering tremendously, and while there's a real nationalist fervor to keep fighting until victory, there are people who are seeing that their suffering is just going to get worse and worse. And while it's a minority right now, the polls have shown that those in favor of negotiations are the ones who have been most affected by the war. And that, unfortunately, is a growing number of people victimized by this war. And also what you're seeing now is a big division in Europe. You know, Europe was very united in the beginning and united behind NATO, and our friends in NATO, you know, I've been part of a group for years now called No to NATO that was against NATO expansion, that was against the very existence of NATO. And NATO's, quote, goal, one of the goals is to have each country that's a member of NATO has to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on the military. And this was something that countries in Europe, the organizations, fought against. And they said, we don't want to be like the United States spending so much of our money on the military. We actually have a national health care system in our country. We actually have free college education for our young people. And we won't have that if we go towards the goals that NATO wants us to do. But after the Russian invasion, there was suddenly the floodgates open to spending massive more amounts of money on the military. But there is very high inflation in Europe right now, and people are making the connection between inflation and the sanctions against Russian energy. Because in a place like Germany, that was the richest country in Europe, its manufacturing sector was really based on relatively cheap Russian energy. And now that they're not getting that, The prices of energy are about 3 times what they were in February. And there are businesses, lots of them, going out of business now in Germany and other parts of Europe. And so there has been a difference in the attitudes in places like Germany, France, and Italy, trying to talk to Putin, trying to find some kind of solution, versus some of the Baltic countries, some of the other countries in Europe, and the US that have had this very hard line. And I mentioned that there have been these protests in Europe. In the beginning, they were called by the right-wing parties in Europe. And right-wing parties in Europe are on the ascendancy now. We see them coming to power in places like Sweden and in Italy. And as this goes on and working class people are having a harder time, they're going to be looking for those parties that supposedly have an answer. And right now, it's more the extreme right. Well, the same thing is happening in the United States. And I don't know if you paid attention to the vote that happened when the $40 billion was passed, and not one Democrat objected to it. And then after that, on the pressure from a lot of grassroots groups around the country like you all, there was a letter that the head of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, promoted. Raise your hand if you heard about that letter. Okay, so a lot of you haven't. For those of you who haven't, it was a very mild letter. In fact, it was so much praising the US military support of Ukraine that a lot of organizations did not support that letter, even though we knew it was the best thing we were going to get from Congress, and we were pushing our Congresspeople to sign it. And that letter started circulating back in the summer. And it said, "Thank you, Biden, so much for all the support that you've given to Ukraine, and that the resistance has been able to be so strong thanks to the military and economic aid that we've been giving Ukraine. But we think that it's time to pair that, P-A-I-R, pair that with negotiations." And I remember seeing that letter early on. I said, "Ugh, I don't really like that letter." But everybody's going to sign that letter. I mean, what's there to object to there? And there are 100 members of the Progressive Caucus, and I figured 100 members are going to sign on, and then we'll get some of the more moderate Democrats. I knew we wouldn't get Republicans because it started out with all the praise for Biden. Lo and behold, time went on, they kept extending the letter. Usually these letters are open for like 2 weeks and that's it. And they just weren't getting the sign-ons. And so it got extended and extended and extended. And finally, it just came out like 2 weeks before the election, and all hell broke loose there, with people who signed it saying, "Take my name off it," with other Democrats saying, "How dare you come out with something that is different from the Biden administration policy." They hated that it came out close to the elections, and I think the timing was pretty bad, saying that we want to show our Democratic Party united behind Ukraine. But the objections were just furious. And there were people immediately saying, "Take my name off," like Jamie Raskin, or even Ilhan Omar said, I don't want my name on that. I signed it way back in the summer when things were different, but now Ukraine is winning, so why would we call for negotiations? I mean, it was really remarkable. There was one member of Congress, Ro Khanna, who went on CNN and said, "I stand by this letter of negotiations," but he's like the only one. And I remember at that time when that letter was circulating, we were going through the halls of Congress and we went into the Senate and said, "Oh, there needs to be a Senate version of this letter, this very mild letter." And so we went to Bernie Sanders' office. And Bernie Sanders' office, the person we were meeting with said, we said, can Bernie initiate the letter in the Senate? And they said, "We think this letter is tone deaf." And I said, "Yeah, we do too, but it's the best that we're going to get And they said, no, Medea. We're saying it from the other side. We're saying that we shouldn't be calling for negotiations. You can't negotiate with Putin. He's a monster. You can't negotiate with him. And we're saying, oh my God, this is Bernie Sanders. And in the meantime, you see there were 57 members of the Republican House and 11 Republicans in the Senate that voted against the $40 billion, some of them for very reasons many of us in this room would not be happy with, saying that our real enemy is China, let's put that money towards dealing with China, and others said we need that for militarizing our borders so that these hordes of immigrants won't come in. But some of them said we need that money for domestic needs. And they said that we're hearing from our base that they don't want us to be spending all this money on Ukraine when there are so many things here at home. Well, some of the most extreme right-wing members of Congress are the ones that are putting themselves forward as the peacemakers now. And the most extreme one is a guy called Paul Kusar. Have you heard of him? He's from Arizona. And some of you shaking your head, you know of him, and I don't know which of the crazy things that you remember of him, but one of the most prominent ones was the videos that he put out, like cartoon videos of him killing AOC and with swords against trying to kill Biden. And even the Republicans said that's over the top. They censored him, they took him off all the committees. This guy wrote a letter to Zelensky and Putin saying, please come to Arizona so we can all sit down and talk and figure this thing out. Who else is there calling for negotiations? Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been calling for negotiations now for months. He has been going to rallies and calling for it. He has been using social media calling for it. And yesterday, when he came out with his announcement that he was running for president, he came out again and said, what do you get when you get Biden? You get war. When you have me, somehow he said that he had been in for decades, where, you know, he can exaggerate, of course, but, you know, there was peace when I was there. And he's been saying, if I were president, there would not be a war in Ukraine because I would talk to Putin. And Biden refuses to talk to Putin. And we better do something about this because this can lead us to World War III, and then there won't be life on this planet. So, you know, as much as whatever you want to say about Donald Trump, he's a smart politician. And he puts his finger up in the air and he sees which way the wind is blowing, and he's recognizing that there are a lot of Americans who are asking questions about this. And that resonates with a lot of people in this country. And so I think we have to wrap our heads around what is happening right now. That the peacemakers, or those who are putting themselves forward as the peacemakers, are right-wing extremists, are Donald Trump, are Tucker Carlson on Fox News, and yet where are the people who are supposed to be the peacemakers? Where are the people who really do genuinely, morally, deep down care about peace?
Right here.
So that's the question that we have to talk about tonight. And for those who say you can't talk to Putin, and there are many people who say that, I want to put out a couple of things. One is the simplest thing: try it. See what happens. Biden has not talked to Putin, and Biden has refused to talk to Putin. Even when Putin was going to be at the G20 that took place yesterday, he said, I have no intention to talk to him. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, you know, that is the #1 diplomatic post in our country. You would think that he would be talking on a regular basis to his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Russia. He has not talked to him about the war once since this started. In fact, what he's been doing is going around the world ginning up more weapons from other countries to be sent to Ukraine. That's the #1 diplomat. Now, we have found out in recent days there have been some discussions between Russia and U.S. officials, and those are the head of the CIA, William Burns, the head of the National Security Council, Jake Sullivan, and the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, Why are they talking to their counterparts? Because they are deathly afraid that this war will expand beyond Ukraine. And they want to find ways to communicate to stop that from happening. Which says to me that the US position is to let this war go on, and Ukrainians keep dying and dying, but to make sure that there's not one American who dies in this. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I don't feel very good about that, because I don't want Ukrainians to keep dying and dying. No. And so I think we have to ask, to talk about some other kinds of communication that has been happening. For example, between Russia and Ukraine, there has been a series of negotiations on specific issues. For example, the grain. You know, who knew before this war started that between Russia and Ukraine, it was such a major supplier of wheat to the world, especially to the Middle East and to Africa. And so there was an outcry saying we have to get this grain out, and there were negotiations, and the UN was a part of those negotiations, and Turkey, and they got land corridors, and they got sea corridors, and there's been about 10 million tons of grain that has gotten out thanks to that agreement, which expires November 19th and hopefully will be continued. There's the other issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And remember when it seemed a couple of months back like that was about to explode, because there was shelling going on and both sides accusing the other, and there were negotiations, and they agreed to have the International Atomic Energy Association come into that plant. And then there have been negotiations about prisoner swaps. Not one, not two, not three, not four. I think there have been about 18 prisoner swaps in less than 9 months. That, you know, just think about what it takes to do one prisoner swap. To get to an agreement about who from your side and who from our side and how many, and how are you going to make that happen, and do we trust you to really do what you say you're going to do? And that has happened over and over and over again. So the sides can talk to each other. The question is, will they start talking to each other about stopping the war? And it's not only Ukraine and Russia that have to talk to each other, it is also Russia and the United States, because there are issues that Ukraine can't negotiate on. And in fact, what's amazing, in the middle of probably definitely the lowest point in terms of US-Russian relations since the Cold War, they actually have agreed that they're going to keep talking about the New START Treaty, which is about nuclear weapons and having inspections, each side inspecting the others. Well, that has to be done between the US and Russia, just like there have to be other arms reduction treaties between those two countries. There have to be talks between the two countries about how the US and when the US would lift sanctions on Russia. And then Russia's security interests with US bases all around the region have to be discussed as well. So there are a lot of things that have to be negotiated. The question is when, and how long is this war going to drag on until we get to the point where all sides realize that that's the only way to end this. And in that, I think we have to bring in the issue of what's happening around the globe. Because both at the General Assembly of the United Nations that happened in September and the COP27 climate talks that are going on right now in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, the issue of Ukraine keeps coming up over and over and over again. And one of the ways that issue keeps coming up is that unlike smaller, more localized wars, this war is affecting the entire planet. And when you have the level of inflation that's happening all over the world, and let's remember the world has not recovered from COVID yet, and you have a climate crisis, you have a perfect storm of these three things happening at the same time. And so at the UN General Assembly, I listened to every single speech of every single head of state. and 66 of them came up and used their little 15 minutes that they have to address the world to say, we are being affected by this war. We don't want to be pushed to take one side or the other. There's only one side that we want to take, and that's the side of peace. That's what big countries like China and India are saying. That's what small countries like island nations are saying. And that's what they're saying at COP27 as well. And one of the things they're saying at COP27 is, you, the wealthier countries, promised us a global climate fund that was supposed to have $100 billion every year, and you have never complied with that. And now we have huge losses, and we need another fund for losses and damage. And we need you to put real money into that fund. And they give as an example what happened in Pakistan with a third of the country underwater. And children in Pakistan dying every single day from the effects of that flooding, and them saying, we don't have even 1% of the global carbon footprint. And yet we are the ones who are dying as a result of your lifestyles and your refusal to get off fossil fuels. And island nations that are saying, our nations are going underwater. We're going to be extinct. And so where is the money that you said you were going to devote for this? And they're not dumb. They said, we see that in less than a year, you in the West have already put over $100 billion into a war in Ukraine. Where are your priorities? And that's a question that we have to answer. Where are our priorities? And when you think today about us being so close to a potential nuclear war, we have to look back at what happened another time in our quite recent history when we were also on the verge of a nuclear war, and that was 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's now the 60th anniversary of that crisis. And it's interesting how it's portrayed in a lot of the history books, and how it's portrayed to the American people, was that John F. Kennedy stood firm those 13 very, very dangerous days and demanded that Russia take its missiles that were pointed at us 90 miles from our shore in Cuba and take them back to Russia. And that because he was tough, the Russians did that. The reality is that they decided that Khrushchev and Kennedy understood that the future of humanity was in their hands, and they had to compromise. And the compromise, which wasn't told to the American people, is that the United States would take its missiles out of Turkey. And that kind of compromise saved us from a nuclear war. And Kennedy, a year after, was speaking at American University, and he gave a talk that I just want to read one line of because it's so eerie about our situation today. He said, nuclear powers must avert confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. And they added then, to adopt that kind of a course, meaning to put your adversary in that position, in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. A collective death wish for the world. And that's pretty much where we are today. If we continue to back Putin, who has staged his entire career as the head of Russia on this war, to back him into a corner where his only choice is a humiliating defeat or the use of a nuclear weapon.